we'll get started. So thank you for everyone for attending today's training. We're going to cover organization first, and design will be the second half of the training. These 4-point overviews are abbreviated versions of basic training. The previous 2 points, economic restructuring and promotion, were covered a couple of weeks ago. We're also recording this, and just like 2 weeks ago, those sessions will be available up on the web, both the video component, which will have the PowerPoint, as well as the narrated voiceover, and also a PDF outline of the presentation. So other housekeeping duties, if obviously if you have questions, you can ask me and I'll have to repeat them so they get recorded. And then people joining via webinar, they will not be able to ask questions, but they'll be able to type them in, and we'll pause periodically and see if we have any questions so we can answer those. But moving on to organization, some of the things that we'll cover today are roles of board and committees, fundraising, volunteer recruitment, development, and retention, communications, internal and external, how to run a committee, and work planning. Those are all critical aspects of what a organization committee, and by extension the board of a Main Street organization, has to deal with. So you'll hear this later, and any basic training that discusses a particular point always says that that point is the most important, right? And so organization is the most important point, but it does fit in with the overall comprehensive 4-point approach. And organization really allows, it's important because it provides a structure and framework for the organization, to the Main Street organization, to conduct its work. Otherwise, you may have volunteers and great ideas, but without again that framework and structure, you wouldn't be able to conduct the activities and be successful. In terms of a flow chart, I think this best demonstrates how organization fits into the overall 4-point approach and the structure of a Main Street organization. So the overall accountability of the program rests with the board of directors, and which are all volunteers, 9 to 15 members typically, and we'll go through some of the roles of each in a minute. And then under the board are 4 committees, one for each point, which then can be subdivided into separate subcommittees to address individual projects. And then supporting the work of the committees and the board of the organization is this general pool of volunteers, and so they're not volunteers who are assigned to a particular committee. They just help to implement the work of the organization. And we shouldn't forget about the executive director, who is typically the only paid staff, paid position of a Main Street program. And the executive director obviously reports to the board of directors and then coordinates the vast majority of the work of the organization. But all of these entities and subcommittees, the executive director, the volunteers, they're ultimately responsible to the community. And even though they're implementing the mission and vision of the organization, that mission and vision is born out of the larger community vision, and so that community has to be kept in mind. The board of directors is the oversight of the program. They really establish the framework and do kind of the nuts and bolts management of the organization. I should mention too that in addition to all of these things, just like the executive director is the face of the organization, the board members, in particularly the 4 officers, are also very prominent members of the organization. So those people have interact with media and really represent the organization within the community. But we'll touch on some of the specifics of what the board does in a little while. The committees are what separates the Main Street approach from a staff-driven program versus a volunteer-driven program. It's not just so because the director can't do it alone that we have committees, but it allows for the community to be involved. It also brings to the table a variety of different skills that are going to be needed to implement the work of the organization. So this volunteerism is really critical, and the committee members and chairs are along with the board members are the very important component of a Main Street organization. The committees they essentially develop the work plans of the organization. So each committee addresses a particular point. So we have 4 committees, but the work plan, even though it's guided by the input from the board, is developed at the committee level. So the committees develop the annual work plan. They also have to figure out how much things are going to cost and develop an annual budget. And then through interaction with the board, the work plan is reviewed, potentially sent back to the committees, and then ultimately budget and work plan are adopted by the board. And to further facilitate that communication, this internal communication between the board and committees, it's not uncommon. In fact, it's encouraged that board members also sit on committees. So, and in certain cases, they also chair committees, and that's obviously developed on a case-by-case basis. Why do we have 1 staff member? Well, it's not that you can't have more or you shouldn't have more, but again, it's to separate this from a staff-driven aspect approach to a volunteer-driven organization. The 1 staff member really permits the volunteers in the community to be the stakeholders and to own the work that the organization is doing. But it is important to have at least that 1 staff because, well, someone has to know everything that's going on. Someone has to attend all of the committee meetings, be the spokesperson for the organization, write and manage grants, and coordinate volunteers. So that executive director position is very important. That person is a multitasker, has to have a number of different skills in order to be able to accomplish all of these things. Are there any questions at this point before we move forward? Okay. The organization committee, we already mentioned that it's the most important committee. Oh, here's why: because it deals with money, people, and communication. Without you might have the volunteers and great ideas, but without the money to implement these projects, you're really going to be hard-pressed to get anything accomplished. If you have the money and you communicate very well but don't have the people to do anything, you're also not going to be able to do much. And then in a lot of cases, the fundraising aspect is okay, and you have sort of enough volunteers to implement your projects, but the organization falters in communication, both with the community in terms of informing the community what it's about, what it's doing, where it needs help, and then also internally. Internal communication helps to eliminate a lot of overlap and essentially makes for a smoothly run organization. So the organization committee really has its hands full. It's not really a glamorous kind of a role, although the Economic Restructuring Committee might take the crown for the least glamorous committee. But it is all of this work really is critical so that the flashier committees like design can really look good. So here are the basic objectives of the organization committee. It assists the board with fundraising. So even though the board of directors of a Main Street program is responsible for the fundraising component, and it's not just the organization committee that assists the board, but all the other committees do as well, as we'll see in a little while. But typically that is within the purview of the org committee. So, and you can do that in a number of different ways. The typical are annual gifts as well as signature fundraising events. All of those have to be coordinated and most likely with other committees in order to be held and successful. The recruitment, retention, and recognition of volunteers is very important, and organization committee deals with that too. And then again with communications. So presenting the program to the public, both in a positive and effective way, as well as making sure that the internal communication allows for the organization to run effectively and eliminate any overlaps and duplication and those sorts of things. So let's talk about fundraising first. As I already mentioned, the board is responsible for that, but the committees, and particularly the organization committee, assist with that as well. And since a lot of the even a fundraising event is an actual project of a committee, it may be a cooperation between the promotion committee and organization committee. That means that a lot of people are involved in putting everything together, including any sort of fundraising campaign, membership brochures. All of those are initiated at the board level but executed at the committee level. So, and then obviously there's staff that writes and manages grants as well and assists everyone else in that aspect. So everyone raises funds for Main Street. The one distinction here is that staff should, and staff being the executive director, has to kind of be careful in terms of fundraising, so the perception is not that the executive director is raising his or her own salary. And that's why we generally limit the fundraising activity associated with the executive director to writing and management of grants. So basically, you shouldn't be out there soliciting business owners for a paid membership or donations to the Main Street program. Sponsorships for events is different, but again, paid membership may be perceived as raising your own salary, and you want to eliminate that as much as possible. What do you need money for? Well, the question should be, what don't you need money for? So obviously staff at the top, that tends to be one of the higher expenses of an organization. Overhead costs such as rent, computers, website, newsletter, all of those things need to be accounted for. And then there are committee costs, so including reimbursements that for out-of-pocket expenses for committee members that you may have. The caveat here is that the committees can also earn income from their activities, so that sometimes is hopefully offsets those costs. Yes, Bob.
So we're not talking about money for specific projects like trees, flowers, or beautification.
The question is whether we're talking about specific projects or not. No, this is basically what, in a general sense, what day-to-day operations, what an organization needs funds for. Obviously, there are specific projects that have associated costs with them, and I guess you could include them in committee costs as well. But perhaps the last point is where that would be described under small incentives for rehab, such as signs and awnings. That could be an incentive pool that has to be fundraised for, and again, any sort of specific projects, like you said, be it benches or streetscape or those kinds of things, or banners, would obviously have associated costs with them, and you could do a fundraising campaign for those, get a sponsorship, or any combination of those. So, very good question. Main Street budgets in general, obviously, as you start your organization, they're going to be rather small and then grow incrementally. The budgets are kind of dependent on the local organization's persistence in soliciting funds, and you have to actively fundraise in order to develop your budget. You can't just hope that people will show up with money at your doorstep. So local talent and persistence are very important in making sure that you do have an adequate budget to execute the work of the program. It actually seems that as time goes on, it's harder to raise money, and the reason for that is that as you're developing the organization, as you're getting it started, you can kind of build off certain excitement and newness and freshness that's associated with the program, and people tend to offer more money to see and to participate in your cause. Rather, as time goes on and you have some long-standing events, and there's quite a bit of repetition, and people always look for that freshness and not staleness in order to contribute to the organization. So on the flip side, as your organization becomes more viable within the community, there may be more sources for you to tap into. As you become more known and you have certain successes that you can recite and demonstrate, have basically a portfolio, that can certainly help with fundraising. And typically, after year 2 of a organization's life, you kind of want to think about long-term sustainability. To begin with, here's the slide that we want. A startup Main Street budget is generally composed of 3 parts. We've broken up the fundraising component into sponsorship and special events, but a third generally comes from the local government, third in membership, and then in this third in sponsorship and special events. So as you're starting up your organization, this government funding and participation is very important. It tends to decrease somewhat, historically speaking, as the organization goes on. It should never be completely eliminated. It's very important for the local government to to remain an active stakeholder in the program, so that fundraising, whether it's direct or this budgetary involvement, whether it's through a direct operational budget, help or through in-kind donation or both is very important for the local municipality to maintain. And we'll finish with the 3 big secrets about fundraising, which aren't really secrets. People give money to people, not causes. And I think that's very important to remember. And I think that holds especially true for Main Street programs where it's a closer knit community. They're generally in smaller towns. So people ultimately will, yes, they may perceive funding a cause, but they're entrusting certain people in furthering and implementing that cause. Number 2, you have to actually ask for the money. So if you don't, and so then 3 is if you don't ask, you won't get it. So kind of no-brainers, but I think you know, as Main Street organizations and all nonprofits, you really have to learn how to ask for the money and actually do it. And again, don't hope that people are going to show up and just give their money away, because you're competing with many more organizations, not just for time, but also for funds. There are many civic and community-minded organizations in all of our small communities, and you can bet that those organizations ask for funds, and that's why they get them, and you have to do the same. That wraps up fundraising. Again, we're breezing through this because it's a very abbreviated segment of the full basic training. So, but we hope to cover some of the basic components of this. Any questions about fundraising? No? Okay. Well, and we can always have a Q&A at the end. So if you do have questions about fundraising later, don't hesitate to ask. We can always go back to it. So volunteers. I love that photograph because what a perk, right? I mean, if you could offer a free parking spot to your volunteers, you'd have a lot more than you have now. How many do you need? Well, again, volunteers are characterized as board and committee members, but I think what we're going to focus on here is that general pool of volunteers. So if you think about that flow chart that we saw at the beginning, it's those people that aren't committee members that that want to participate in fulfilling specific tasks and be assigned to very specific activities on your work plan. So although those individuals often move up into sitting on committees and even being board members later on. But Main Street organization needs hundreds of volunteers every year. Startup organizations should have about 40. Again, that depends on the size of the community, but generally speaking, 40 volunteers would be a good number to start with. But you immediately start building that base and partner base, and partner base includes all of those other community organizations that you can sort of borrow and exchange volunteers with. And you will need more volunteers every year. Just because you have a certain number of volunteers now doesn't mean that those same people will be available again next year and the year in and year out. So building that base and retaining and replenishing that base is critical and not always easy. So when dealing with volunteers, this positive attitude is everything, and you have to believe that the experience that you're going to offer the volunteers is valuable, not just towards your work plan, implementing your ideas, but also to the volunteer itself. So it has to be a great experience, and that's that's what you have to offer to volunteers, because you'll never have enough of them. And as you rotate volunteers in and out, I think what you want is this to be sort of a self-sufficient recruitment method. I mean, what a great testimonial to have is, for a neighbor sharing with their friends, that I volunteered with Main Street this past summer. What a great experience! I did this, I did that. You guys should do it if you're looking for something to do. I think that's something that you should strive to have this great attitude and positive experience that is associated with the organization. When it comes to volunteerism, so volunteers, when they work with you, they give you their time, and their time is their most valuable thing that they can give you, because you're pulling them away from their families and leisure time, as well, again, from these other groups, like let's say the Kiwanis Club, the Rotary Club, and all those other volunteer and member-based groups. And so you really have to work to elevate your program in the eyes of the volunteer, and make sure they understand that their experience is going to be worthwhile, and that the work that you're doing makes a difference in the community. And really, the general principles are the same, not just for the Main Street program, but for other non-for-profits that are volunteer-based. So when volunteers consider volunteering their time for your organization, they're looking for meaningful work, because, again, their time is their most valuable asset. So they're looking for satisfaction in their experience. I think they're looking for that organization, whether they mention that or not. If you're not able to express what it is exactly that you want them to do, that might not inspire a lot of confidence in your organization. So why should I, bother helping you if you don't have your stuff together, basically? So this organizational component, and being able to point to specific tasks and telling them how long things are going to take and what needs to happen, having as much information ahead of time as possible will help you in attaining volunteers and retaining volunteers. Giving back to the community is something that a lot of volunteers look for. So again, that goes back to the mission and vision of your organization, in order to make sure that it is a community-driven approach. I think volunteers are also looking for some ownership and an opportunity to provide input, not just show up, do something, and leave, but if they have something important to say, or if they have a way to improve the work of the organization, that there is a mechanism for them to voice that, and for them to know that they've been heard. It's important to remain flexible and offer them a schedule that can fit in with their jobs, family, leisure, and then lastly, make it fun. I think maybe the fun component can transcend all of these things. If it's fun, people will do it, and people will come back. So volunteers today are perhaps somewhat different than when the Main Street approach started some 25 going on 30 years ago. People have probably more distractions now than ever, and they look to be even more efficient with their time. So short-term assignments and are very critical, and also creating different types of volunteer opportunities. So to again attract maybe the older retirees who tend to be more traditional and can devote larger blocks of time to the younger people who are again they're have a lots of different interests competing for their attention, and are looking for very short and specific blocks of time in order to capture their attention. We have the web now, and actually social media, something that wasn't effectively utilized just a few years ago. So you can use that as a recruitment tool. And then again, when you make it fun and make it the coolest thing to do in town, then it will the word will spread, and hopefully that will help in attaining more volunteers. Here are some statistics about volunteerism today. An amazing 44% of Americans volunteer. I think that speaks highly of us as a society. Interesting statistics are or that people that give money are also more likely to volunteer. So as you're approaching, as you know, your fundraising component can be a dual fundraising and volunteerism drive. So look for those people who donate to the cause, and again, they're more likely, they're believers, so they might most likely also participate personally. 89% donate money with an average gift of $1,620. You know, if you could string a few of those averages together, that wouldn't be a bad deal. So something to keep in mind. Volunteerism is more common in towns than cities. No surprise there. That's why the Main Street approach, which is volunteerism based, is so successful in smaller communities. And here the last point is very critical, something that I think Main Street has struggled with as an approach. We're certainly seeing improvements in that regard, but embracing youth and allowing them an opportunity to get involved, because if we create those positive volunteer experiences for them when they're younger, they're more likely to volunteer as adults. So you're not just building a volunteer base within the community, you're really building a volunteer sort of a family and a lifelong experience. So those are possibilities that exist. Grabbing that youth and then hoping that they will come back, and maybe in a roundabout way even, you know, maybe they don't volunteer as adults with the Main Street group, but they remain involved in the community, and you know, your paths will certainly cross again in the future. You're investing in the youth development, basically. Additional statistics: people with more education and money tend to volunteer, and then slightly more women than men. Volunteerism peaks between ages 30 and 40. The caveat or the difference here then is that a lot of retirees volunteer quite a bit too. So, and that obviously doesn't occur between ages 30 and 40. So, also people who volunteer for other organizations are more likely to volunteer with your group. But here, once again, there's only so many organizations and boards and committees that a person can sit on. So the more positively you can position your organization to compete for those volunteers, the better. And I mentioned this before, joiners are more generous with their time and money. So people who are members of the organization obviously have a stake. So they're going to devote more time and financial commitment towards the success of the organization. In terms of working with other groups and where to get volunteers, here are just some suggestions. Schools are great, and obviously that allows you to hook that youth component, and it's a sort of a ever sustainable supply because kids get older, graduate, but others come in. So if you can develop a good rapport with educational institutions and clubs and different programs, that those relationships can last into the future. Community service organizations are great because their mission generally fits within the mission and vision of the Main Street program. So a lot of times you will cooperate and coordinate with them on specific events anyway. They can be a great source for volunteer prospects too. Religious institutions are very good. Senior centers, again, working with retirees. Most of these are sort of common sense and no-brainers in terms of where you can get some good prospects. In terms of how you should proceed and what you should have in place when you get volunteers, having those job descriptions, just like you would have job descriptions for board members and committee members. And again, if you include board and committee members in this discussion, then you want job descriptions so people know what you want them to do. It's like you're hiring somebody. And these job descriptions should flow from the work plan. So you develop the work plan, you have certain holes to fill, you know what you need that needs to get done because your work plan is very good and you have very good tasks that are very detailed and very outlined, and that allows you to write very good job descriptions for your volunteers. So be as detailed and explicit as possible. Again, when you're seeking that volunteer, that will help them determine if it's something that they want to do or not. Having a volunteer coordinator is good too, and not just good, but important because that person can kind of maintain this database, and as you have events that you need people to fulfill certain tasks, the volunteer coordinator will let you know who's available and have all of the contact information on that's necessary. Having volunteer orientation and training is important, and it's something that meaning Main Street organizations don't necessarily always do. It's something that's taken for granted, I think, because everybody that's associated with the organization represents the organization. It's important that the volunteers not just have a positive experience, but also positively reflect the work of the organization. So there is some kind of minimum code of conduct that should be expected of everybody that takes on projects, and all of those things, including the work plan specific things, as well as the general mission and vision of the organization, should be covered in orientation and training. Your hope is that everybody that does something with the Main Street program can, in 30 seconds, tell you what Main Street program is all about, because that shows that they believe in what it is that the organization does, and that kind of passionate delivery can again entice other volunteers to participate as well. So a good volunteer job description should have at the minimum, the name of the project, who the person should report to, or their supervisor is, including their contact info and cell phone. What is it that you're asking them to do? When they should be doing it, and when should it be complete by? And then also how to get reimbursed for any out of pocket expenses. That's something that always seems to get omitted from the discussion. They're providing their time to you, if they're contributing financially, that should be an acknowledged and separate commitment. You shouldn't expect for them to, to expend money that are their own money on work plan items. If they have to, there has to be a mechanism for volunteer to get reimbursed. Volunteer matching seems something to be a common sense, and when you give work, when you match a volunteer with a specific task, if it's something that they're going to be they're going to like to do and they're good at, then it's a good fit. So that's what that's about. It's making sure that that positive experience and fun happens. If you give somebody something to do that they don't want to do, and or they have no idea how to do it, and you didn't tell them how you expect it to be done, it's not going to work out so well. Volunteer supervision. Supervision is maybe a little bit of a harsh word. It's more of an oversight. It's you do want to have somebody that ensures that the work that you're asking the volunteers to do does happen, and that tends to be the role of the event or committee chair. So if you have a particular project that's a work plan item, and that person, you have a particular person assigned to oversee that, that could be the that same person would serve as a volunteer supervisor for that project. But it's just about making sure that everybody understands their assignments and does everything on time, but also to provide encouragement and advice, and again, make sure that the experience of the volunteers is a positive one. Volunteer retention is something that that a lot of programs struggle with, and it's because it's harder to recruit new people. You should always retain the people that you have, but avoiding burnout too. So you want to rotate volunteers perhaps from committees, and if you sense that there's a certain burnout or a high level of stress, stepping in and managing the situation. Because if the volunteer is good, you'd hate to lose them because of some conflict or again burnout. If they can be, if you can give them a break or assign them to a different task, then you can resolve the situation and keep a good volunteer. But if you provide training and good job description, again, it kind of all starts at the beginning. All of these mechanisms, the retention, a good retention program starts with a good recruitment program. So if you have all of these things in place when you recruit the volunteers, they're more likely going to be, you're more likely to retain them, and they're going to repeatedly volunteer for you. You should also offer an opportunity for advancement. So you have your star volunteers that can not just rotate but move up into serving on a committee, chairing a committee, being a board member, and then maybe eventually even being on the executive committee, and leading the organization in some sort of more prominent role. So as you recognize those volunteers, it's important to retain them and give them opportunities to do various things within the organization if that's what they want to do. And in order to provide a positive experience and also to retain volunteers, it's very important to recognize volunteers. I think most volunteers don't volunteer their time in order to be thanked publicly or recognized in a certain way, but they do appreciate that immensely. So don't underestimate the value of thanking the volunteers, and that could be done in numerous ways. Praising them personally, or through thank you cards or certificates, or through awards programs, service pins, letters of recommendations, or even more subtle ways, as in asking them for advice or including them in meetings. You essentially have to figure out how a volunteer would like to be thanked based on their personality, and utilize any of these plus more ways to thank different people in different ways. So, but you should take every opportunity that you can to do that. So to sum it all up, in terms of a great volunteer experience, you want to make sure that you clearly define their tasks and give them a good timeline, or provide a timeline for completion of these tasks, provide appropriate training, use their time well, and make it fun for them, and then give additional responsibilities to star performers, and then thank them, praise them, and then give them a break from occasionally. So all of these things, if you do all of these things, or most of these things, you're going to get volunteers, and they're going to have a great experience, and you're going to be able to retain them and have them come back. Any questions about volunteerism at this point? No? Okay. Well, we'll move on to communication, internal and external. Beginning with external communication, it's very important, and again, this is organization, so this is why organization is so important to the work of a Main Street program. All of these things can serve to promote the organization and inform the community at large of the work that the Main Street program is doing. So you have newsletters, websites, blogs, social networking, relatively new for the purposes that we're utilizing it for, media releases, your visual identity program, so your branding also promotes the organization, and it's the trademark of the group. Annual gifts, reports, and any sort of brochures and marketing material that you develop that talks about you, that's out there, it all promotes the work of the organization, and it's very important that those materials do that accurately and be of good quality too. So, yes, question. There's a question about what constitutes annual gifts, and yes, they could be scholarships, they could be things that any promotional materials that the organization gives to their members. So they tend to be tied into fundraising components too. So let's say you have like the Christmas ornament that's very popular of a particular building downtown. That would be an annual gift, but one that can also be a fundraising component as well, because you can sell it and recoup your costs and raise funds that way too. So, but those are just some examples of what are gifts. External communication is about promoting not the district, the Main Street district itself, but the work of the organization. So they sometimes seem like they're one and the same, but there is a distinction. So you're presumably, by promoting the work of the organization and the good work of the organization and your successes, you're also promoting the district but it is about the Main Street organization. That needs to be the focus. Typical activities, we've already mentioned some of these are newsletters and their print and email versions, websites, social media. All of those things can and should be utilized to communicate with the community at large. And then there is an internal level or layer of communication that allows for the various volunteers and committee members and the board and the executive director to effectively communicate with one another and make sure that things run smoothly and that projects get accomplished and everything works. So that could also be through similar means as external communication, like websites and newsletters. But then there are also specific tasks and activities and ways to communicate just with the volunteers of the organization, such as listservs or email blasts between from the board or the executive director to committee members, and then also something as simple as distributing meeting minutes from various committees to one another, so they know what other committees are doing. It's common practice that the board reviews these, but not necessarily the other committees. So this level of communication should be, both up and down, go both ways between the board and the committees and vice versa, and also cross-committee communication as well. So the work plan is one of those tools because it's a written. Let me go back to this slide. It's a written record of what the organization hopes to do, and what it takes to do it, and then also of its successes and less failures. We want successes, right? So, but as the work plans get completed, they serve as a record of accomplishment for the organization. And a good work plan is utilized to solicit funds and volunteers too. So we can't underestimate its importance. But before you develop the work plan, you have to have some committee members, and just like every other committee, you want to have a good cross-section of the community on the org committee, which means having merchants and property owners and residents and civic group leaders, as well as reporters, accountants, volunteer specialists. All of these people can serve on the org committee, and we'll get to some specific tasks. What you really need on the org committee are perhaps different tasks than on some of the other committees, although some of them overlap. You need writers, which obviously contribute to the newsletter, news releases, flyers, those kinds of things. You need the movers and the shakers, the people for volunteer recruitment, the meeters and greeters. Then you can have, I think that's why accountants was on the previous slide, was people good with databases and numbers. So I don't think you need to be an accountant to maintain a volunteer database, but so be it. And then public speakers to conduct a training, and again, you want to have somebody that can effectively vocalize the goals of the Main Street program. Other candidates for the org committee, well, you essentially want problem solvers. So you want good organizers, and then again, people that know everyone can help in volunteer recruitment. And then if you have people that know how to throw a good party, then that takes care of volunteer recognition. So all of these different skills and personalities have a crucial role for the org committee. And there's a lot of overlap between org and board. So a lot of these same people are also on your board, or you'd want them to be on your board. In terms of committee members' roles and activities, this isn't specific to just the organization committee, but to all committees as well. And what's expected is that, you know, committee members take on specific tasks. It's not just about participating in meetings, although that's listed here. You really need to, as a committee member, your name needs to be on a work plan item somewhere. When there's training in town, offered by both the state program or the local program, any sort of training that is identified by your chair, committee chair, or the executive director as being useful, try to participate in that training. Stick to the schedule, so working with your work plan. Obviously, working with others is critical. And then recruiting others to help, that's something that every member of the Main Street organization always does, is scouting for additional members and representing the organization positively in the public. It's also not to be underestimated. Everything that everybody does for under the guise of the Main Street program can be scrutinized and can be evaluated. So people need to not just behave themselves, but also to portray the organization in a very positive light. So now, to help the committee members fulfill their individual roles is a chair, and sometimes we have co-chairs, and that obviously depends on the size of the committee or the ability and interest of particular people to serve as chair people. But the chair has a very important role because he or she recruits members and supervises and thanks the volunteers and makes sure that they do what they're supposed to do. The chair runs the meeting, develops the agenda, and takes meeting minutes. I mean, other people can take the minutes, but the chair still takes the responsibility to do that. And again, the chair organizes the work, schedules tasks, makes sure if volunteers are working. So the chair is the micro organizer for that particular group, versus the board of directors does all of these things, but for the organization as a whole. The chair, in terms of communication between the committees and the board, the chair represents the committee, so he or she attends board meetings and brings info back and forth from the board to the committee. So that's important that the chair, in evaluating whether they can take that on, takes that into consideration. Committee members should be encouraged to attend trainings. The chair often works with the executive director to solve any issues and problems, and then stays on top of paperwork that pertains to the committee. So any particular contracts or invoices or volunteer hours that are being tracked by the committee, the chair has a responsibility to do that. And reimbursements, once again, that could be an arrangement between all the committees and the executive director, or perhaps the treasurer of the board that takes care of that. Whatever the procedure is, it's a good idea for the chair to at least be aware of it, to make sure that the committee members of that particular chair are reimbursed. So now you have your committee members, and it's time to develop the work plan. And There are many different formats. We're not going to go through them today, but at the basic level, a work plan should start with a goal. So whatever for your particular committee, let's say it's the organization committee. So it's to make sure that the internal and external communication of the program and the volunteerism and fundraising components are all in place. That's your goal. And then you have specific objectives that help you reach that goal, and then you have specific projects. This is where it really gets down to details, because you develop projects that could be one-time projects or annual projects that repeat, that are your traditional things that you do every year. And then each project gets broken down into specific tasks, and this is where you figure out what the costs are and how much time it's going to take to implement the specific tasks. And that then allows you to go out and seek volunteers and fundraise. And then obviously it's very important to have a timetable to know when the project starts and stops. We also encourage to have a success measure of an evaluation within the work plan. So it's not just about getting it done, but having a mechanism to go back and tell whether that particular event, let's say, was worth it. Yes, we accomplished our task or our objective, but at a cost of 200 volunteer hours, and maybe, our goal should have been to get this done under 100 hours, and really this is such a time suck for our volunteers. We probably should evaluate how to do this, and those kinds of things will help you to make sure that you're holding your successful projects and not just completing projects. So likely first-year projects for a organization committee. In terms of fundraising, we'll go through fundraising, volunteering, and communications, is to assist the board with fundraising through a number of different strategies. So developing an annual gift database or annual forms, soliciting annual gifts. They don't have to be things that you create necessarily for for the organization. They could be it could be a promotional cooperation with your merchants. So an annual gift could be an item that's already produced or made locally that you then offer through your organization as a gift or as a incentive to join, or whatever it may be. You can develop a sponsorship package, help to develop this signature fundraising event. There typically tends to be one or two events that an organization tends to look to fundraise, and that's what signature relates to. And then helping and approaching potential donors for funds. In terms of recruiting, training, and recognizing volunteer, those are all things that have to happen anyway. And so in terms of the first year, a startup program, those are the things that you would look to have in place. An appreciation event, having an orientation program, having a database, so you can update it and maintain it and know who the people are, their contact information. Having job descriptions is very important. And as well as identifying potential partners for volunteer recruitment. In terms of communication, which is that third goal of the organization committee, you want to have a website, and websites are it's such a given that you have to have a website. And I would like to add to this, not just start the website, but there's really no excuse for a bad website either. So there are a lot of tools out there, and there, some Main Street programs. I'm not going to name any. I'm not saying in Illinois, but there are some websites out there that are pretty horrendous. So it's a I could say non-Illinois, right? All of our Illinois programs have awesome websites. So it's hopefully nobody out of state will listen to this. But the point being that starting the website is a pretty low threshold. You not only should start one, but have a good one and maintain it and make sure the information's current. There's nothing worse than going to a website in January and reading about an event from last July. So that's not happened in Marengo, right? No. Okay, good. Nowhere in Illinois, for that matter. So you want to develop your media list. You want to be able to tap into media coverage and feed stories and have a good relationship with media as much as you can. Well, know who to contact and don't scram for that as you have something to share. So you can have a quarterly newsletter. You could also have a more frequent monthly or email newsletter on eBlast that you can distribute just internally even, or just to your merchants. You can have flyers about the organization or specific programs that the organization has developed, like your facade improvement grant, for example. You can have posters, and another thing you could do is write a monthly newspaper column, and then developing or joining the speakers bureau. So having basically be on the circuit of speakers within the community and regionally, so you can meet in front of different groups, and all of the groups are looking for monthly speakers at lunchtime. So you should be able to have a either something that's current about the organization, or just a standard spiel that you can go and give in front of a group, preferably with some slides or photographs, and show them all the great things that you do, and tell them about the organization. So, but having someone be on that circuit is important. Congratulations, you made it to through the organization training, and I promise that we'll take questions and a break. But the second half of this is almost all pictures. So you've made it through the most difficult part, and it'll be much easier to get through the second half. So before we take a break, are there any questions regarding organization?
Actually, one about reimbursements, who seem to be pretty important. Is it a good idea to have a written policy about reimbursements?
I think so.
Does Main Street have a template?
The question is there a good idea to have a written policy for reimbursements, and also is there a template? I can't think of a template from the top of my head, although there probably is one, and we can try to locate one. A good place to look for it would be on the National Main Street Center's website, and if you're a member, you can tap into some pretty amazing resources and templates on the website. So I think I answered that yes, you probably should have a written procedure. It's always good to have it in place rather than kind of deal with it as it comes up. So, and generally speaking, that reimbursement would be something that is not is perhaps outside of a budgeted work plan item. And then the only other time it would fall into play, it would be if there was, basically an emergency expenditure or something like that. You had funds budgeted, but something happened, and a volunteer steps forth and said, okay, I'll take care of it as long as you reimburse me later. I think having some kind of policy and a form as people join committees and become volunteers will instill confidence in them that, okay, if something happens, I can be confident enough that I will get reimbursed. So rather than avoiding the issue and just dealing with it after the fact. Other questions? Okay, so there are no organization questions allowed during the design presentation. I'm kidding. We can go back and answer any questions regarding any of it as we talk about it, or at the end. It doesn't matter. But since there aren't any other questions now regarding organization, we'll take a break. And we're running just a little bit ahead of schedule, but we won't take that for granted, because the design presentation is slightly longer. So we'll start back up again at 5 till 7. So it's 6:45 now. Enjoy your break.